Okay, hello and welcome to the Skeptic Hangout, the place where we sit back, relax, and discuss some of humanity's most controversial and intriguing concepts through the lens of skepticism, even when we're at the beach. We have with us today Richard Gilliver from Skeptic Takeout, Laura McGee from Unapologetically Me, from the Yorkshire Atheist. Today, we are going to be discussing labels. They came up quite a bit last week, and I think we have a lot to say on the matter. So grab your English tea or whatever fruity drink you take to the beach with you, and join us as we discuss all the ways in which we categorize, label, relabel, recategorize, well, just about everything. This is episode 20, Labels.
So, labels, what are we thinking about with labels, Mr. Gill?
Well, I know last week we talked a lot about labels. So if people watching haven't checked out our last episode on humanism, that was kind of where the inspiration for this episode came from, wasn't it? So, because we talked about how I identified with the label humanist. Oh, Laura's dropped out. Okay, hopefully she'll bob back in again. I identify with the label humanist, and even though lots about that sort of descriptor, that label fit with you and Laura, neither of you identified with that label specifically, and I thought that was really interesting. And I think a lot of it comes down to not only just like what labels we give ourselves, but what labels we give other people as well. Sorry, I finished a thought just as you took a drink.
You're all right. It's good. I thought it was interesting last week. This is literally the first episode. For those who are watching or listening who don't know how we work, basically what we do is we kind of just come up with ideas for episodes, and we have a big kind of spreadsheet where we just input them as and when they come along. So we've kind of got like maybe a year's worth of episodes written down. Last week was the first time we were actually recording the show, and it was the first time actually on the fly we thought, this is a really good idea for an episode, let's do it. So we've jumped straight in and we're doing it this week. And we're having loads of technical difficulties, so whether that's got anything to do with labels, I don't know. But
well, I don't think so. But I mean, I think certainly Laura's selfish fault for deciding to celebrate the 4th of July weekend. Certainly Laura's fault. And both of us are not jealous at all about her trip to this massive lake in the middle of the Nevada desert.
And it's absolutely chucking it down in Yorkshire.
Just awful. Awful. Well, I just wondered, what are some of the labels that you identify as being sort of, labels that you use to identify yourself, Gilliver?
Well, it's funny because I do attribute a lot of labels to myself. So I use labels, I'm a husband, I'm a father. Hi, Laura.
Hello.
Welcome. You're a bit sideways. I don't know.
Is it sideways? I'm landscape like I was before. Did it turn me funky? Let me try this then.
That's it. Hello.
Hello. Okay, so maybe I can't do landscape like I was before.
So we're jumping in. What we're talking about is labels. And what labels we apply to ourselves. So I'm just saying the labels I apply to myself are father, husband, I'm a bass guitarist, I'm a skeptic, and those are kind of the main labels I apply to myself, because the labels that attribute to large areas of things I do now in my life. I've used other labels in the past. I've used martial artist, wrestler when I was doing those things when I was younger. And they're labels that I attributed to myself in the past, but it's a dynamic thing. It changes constantly.
Yeah. I know some of, most of my social media bios is essentially, I think I mentioned this last week, is basically just a list of labels. So I'm just going to read you my Twitter bio. So I'm 30, I'm a teacher, husband, linguist, musician, Ravenclaw, father, humanist, Whovian, like a Doctor Who fan, atheist, socialist, and Yorkshireman, not necessarily in that order. And so
I'm glad you described what a Whovian was, because I had no.
It's one of those things where if you don't know, you don't need to know.
No. if you
But
don't
no, what I think is so amazing about that is that like all those labels you just gave, you really think about it, that tells a lot about you. Like that gives a lot about who you are just in those few little labels that you put in there.
Yeah. And actually they sort of describe me in different ways. So some of them it's my relationship to other people. So the fact that I am married and the fact that I have children describes that I'm a husband and a father, whereas some of it's to do with my outlook on life. So like humanists,
like
and atheists, and Ravenclaw, absolutely. Do you associate with the Harry Potter house? That's a very important character trait for millennials, but I don't know of your generation.
I've seen all of the films. My children and my wife are interested in the films. I've watched films. I don't mind the films. I can sit through them. My biggest single memory of Harry Potter, and I want to get onto Laura's labels in a minute as well, but my single biggest memory of Harry Potter was I'm a postman by trade. That's the job I do in real life. And when one of the Harry Potter books was released years and years ago, because I've been incredibly old, I've been doing the job for a long time, and I remember delivering it to this. She must have been about 13 or 14, this girl, and I didn't even get down the path. She literally came running out of the house, flung her arms around me, took the package off me. She obviously presumed it was hers, and went, "Thank you, you're my favourite postman ever," and ran back into the house while unwrapping the thing, and that was the end of it. And that was, I'll never forget. That was such an endearing memory.
Wow, that's actually kind of adorable.
That's really lovely.
I loved it, me. I thought it was fantastic.
So, Laura, what labels do you use to describe yourself? I think we were asking the same question at the same time, Gilliver.
Oh, so okay. I think my labels change pretty fluidly. Like honestly, I think that they change like day to day, year to year. So like right now in this moment, labels that I can think of just off the top of my head, mother, daughter, sister, wife, friend. Oh gosh, so they're all relational labels that are on the top of my mind right now. But then I really hesitate to use labels such as either like Democrat or even like middle of the road, or liberal or conservative. I'd say more liberal. Atheist is one that I'm comfortable with, but really that just it's definitional. Humanist, like we were talking about last week, I struggle with that. Like I don't know, and the only reason I don't know is I have embraced so many labels in the past and then discovered later that maybe it doesn't fully apply to me after all, or maybe all the baggage around it doesn't quite apply to me. So I'm struggling with things like humanist. Even with atheist, I'd be careful how and when I use it, right? I would say labels that describe like who I am in terms of like my sexuality or things like that. I have those labels as well. Shoot, I don't know. There's just so many of them. Like, I don't know what we want to get into or how long we want to talk about them, but
I think it's really interesting that both you and me have said that we kind of use them fluidly and they're changing.
Yeah.
Mine are very set. I've written them down. They're in a list.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. Do you consider that those labels that you've applied to yourself, that you've got on your Twitter thing, are kind of things you've had for a long time and haven't changed or are not likely to change?
That's interesting. I think certainly that list of labels in my bio, I've added to and taken away from every now and then, but this is kind of like the ever existing list
pretty
of labels.
standard.
And I guess I think, and again we mentioned last week, some of those labels are just more important to me sometimes than others, but I think all of them generally apply to me all of the time. It's just like being a Ravenclaw, for example, isn't like, I mean, it's definitional in terms of like it describes some character traits of mine, I guess, and some things that I value, but it's not necessarily the most important, thing in the list.
Is it something that something like that? Is it something that you apply to yourself? Because thinking about the way I kind of describe mine, like, for example, bass guitarist, it's not something I actually apply to myself. it's someone that's useful as a descriptor if someone's asking
Yeah.
about me, rather than it be, I don't walk around thinking to myself, I am a bass guitarist. You know?
And using those labels, then I would have to call myself stuff like singer, musician, hiker, swimmer, biker, like everything that I enjoy doing. You can take what it is that I enjoy and what I'm passionate about. Artist, writer, you know, and you can start creating these labels around it. But then when you really break that label down, you're right.
Have you lost her as well?
Of who I am. So you say like the bass guitarist, right? Like that's just, it's something that you know how to do, right? The label really just helps people, I don't know, to understand more, like that's more of a part of you, but it's more of an activity you do too. So it's interesting the way we use labels to describe different facets of ourselves. You know what I'm saying?
I don't think I can't think of anything off the top of my head that I'd use like in the way Gil has, like identifying with like Ravenclaw with a certain fictional school or whatever it is.
Whatever it is.
Oh, I can totally see that. Like I would call myself like a Trekkie now that he mentions it. Like, and when you say Trekkie, like that means a lot, right? And
and we've lost Laura again, I think. So, yeah.
I don't know. Like, there are fictional, like you talk about people who identify as Jedi, right?
Yeah, and that's interesting because on the UK census, there were a lot of people. It's gone back a couple of times when the census is released every 10 years, and I can remember from at least 20 years ago, possibly even 30. Where people as religion wrote Jedi in the religion section. And there was kind of a big campaign to get that as a recognized thing. I think if you hit so many, it got recognized as an actual thing. I don't know what the truth is about that, but that's kind of the rumor that went around.
Here's something that I think is a very interesting aspect of this as well, which is how people can use a label, but different people can interpret it in different ways. So I know, for example, with Brexit being quite a big deal over the last few years, you may have heard of it. Now, for example, often when you see someone on Twitter who's got like the word European, you know they're British and they've got the word European as one of their labels in their bio, that even though it's an accurate descriptor of every British person, you know, from a technical perspective, with Britain being in Europe, usually that means as a signal to other people, I am pro-European Union. And so it's a word where like you can accurately describe people as being European, but it also signals to other people a specific political stance too.
So in that respect, Laura, in the US, because there was kind of the controversy a few years ago, controversy for some, of getting rid of the rebel flag. And now it seems to be
that's still ongoing. Yeah.
With the thin blue line flag, which is kind of taking over it as kind of the symbol of American.
I think we have both of those now. And I think, go ahead. You were going to ask a question about them.
No, I was just going to say, what's the relation with kind of people who identify in those things? Do they have a specific label they apply to themselves?
I don't know, like the Confederate, like they're still like the Confederates, right? The ones that still fly the Confederate flag and stuff. And I don't know the label that people would give, like with the blue flag, the pro police or pro law enforcement. Like I don't know what label they give themselves. They tend to be lumped in with a lot of like the conservative Christian groups, you know, but they are their own thing, and you don't necessarily have to be conservative or Christian to support that cause. But I think that those two things are perfect examples of what Gil was saying about how a label can mean different things to different people. Yeah. So that Confederate flag thing and labeling yourself a Confederate, like, or even a supporter, to you, it might mean something completely different than someone on the outside, right? And
you hear lots of people using that sort of terminology and those sorts of things to explain a sense of pride in, and I don't know enough about this to speak on it with any sort of authority, but like to talk about a sense of pride in their ancestors and sort of with the South in general and stuff. Whereas obviously most people associate those symbols and that sort of labeling as specifically being racist and pro-slavery and all of that lot.
Yeah.
And that's something I didn't associate with for a long time when I was growing up, because being ignorant of the history of America and things, I'm going back like 35 years, when I was like a boy. And obviously I was ignorant of American history, and I just associated the rebel flag with the Dukes of Hazzard. It was just a TV show, and it was just like,
Right.
it was
Well, there's that too.
It was something cool. It wasn't something like to be like ashamed of or repelled by.
Yeah, there's that too, where it's just sort of a
horror.
cultural thing. Yeah, where it's just sort of part of the cultural history or the upbringing, or where it doesn't have any deeper meaning. I think that there's all those different things. There's the really deep racist type meaning. There's the national pride meaning, and then there's the I just grew up with it, and it's just a symbol of like my culture and my society, and there's really no deeper meaning to it whatsoever. And I think that both of you make a really good point that when you're talking about applying labels, God, it's almost like they could be used for like good or for evil. Like one single label, it could be used as a mark of pride, but it could also be used sort of as a like that same exact label could be used to slander somebody, right? Like, oh, you're racist because of like your ties to the Confederacy or whatever, versus oh, you're proud of your nation's history, or you're proud of being from the South. It's kind of interesting to me how labels can take on so many different meanings depending on your view of it.
How should we address that if we come across someone who was like me, who remained ignorant of America's history and the place that flag played in it? How would you explain to someone who was where I was and who was politically neutral on it, but just looked at it favorably from a cultural standpoint? How would you explain to them that they were wrong in that, in the way they were viewing it, and how they should really be educated and not see it as a positive thing at all in any respect?
I don't know. See, I'm a little bit, this is where I'm going to get a little bit controversial. I don't necessarily think that people need to necessarily be educated on every single, like the history of every single symbol and every single thing. So I think if someone does have sort of an innocent view on it, I think we should be more accepting of that, and we should be more flexible with that, and less needing to make, because what happens is when you start saying, okay, now everyone needs to be educated on its history and needs to be told that it's bad, now you're starting to make things like symbols and ideas good or evil, and you're starting to give them way more power than they deserve. So and the same can be applied to labels. Like you say, okay, I'm going to make the label pansexual bad, right? Or I'm going to educate them on what it really means. Now you're starting to take that label and give it power that it really doesn't need, right? So I think allowing people to have that sort of innocence and not think so strongly about that label is actually better than trying to give that label a specific meaning with a specific set of good or bad intentions behind it. And I don't know if that makes any sense.
That reminds me quite clearly of the whole thing and again, talking about America in the past, but like how the anti-communist stuff in the Cold War in America really turned people against like labels such as socialist, for example, to the point where people think that universal healthcare is a bad thing because it can be described with the label socialist, even though actually when you describe the fundamentals of those systems and talk to people who live in countries with those systems, socialist healthcare is the thing that people absolutely adore about their countries. And you know, there are problems and whatever else, but
and it works for them.
But it's that label socialist which people in the past have assigned a moral judgment as this is an evil thing, a bad thing, a thing that we need to destroy and take down, which has led to people having those attitudes nowadays, which just completely don't make sense with the actual concept.
Yeah, that's why I like when people take labels and they kind of own them, right? Like you take a label that started out evil, like, and I'll start with a really, really tame one, like calling a woman a bitch, right? And that label of like bitch having meaning and having like stuff that goes along with it. When you say that, you have all these ideas of like, oh, she's like a really big pain in the ass. She's outspoken. She's strong. She's rude. She's overbearing, right? And then women take it and we start owning that label, and now it starts to break down its power, and it no longer has that same sense. So I'll be like, wow, you're one hot bitch, right? Or like I have a group on my Facebook chat, right? That's like badass bitches, right? And it's all my friends, and there's women and men in this group. And we just like, hey, what's up, bitches, right? And we kind of break down that label to where it actually means something good or something empowering. So I think that there's a real benefit to taking those labels that have been decided by society or decided by a specific group of people, like this is a negative label and this is the meaning that we are assigning to it, to take it back and take power. And there's other labels I can think of, but then they start getting more like controversial and touchy. But I like seeing people do that, like take labels that are made to hurt them and made to be negative inherently, and changing the meaning around until it breaks down all that power.
Yeah, it's funny because there's actually I've got kind of pretty much the opposite example of that, and that's the and there's nothing. I'm not saying there's anything. I agree with you 100%, but there's the C word, the 4-letter C word, which is where I'm from, is used like liberally by everybody, man, women, like
the C word.
But see, now you can't even use it on this podcast. Like I have no problem with that word whatsoever. If you guys will let me, I'll be the one that breaks the ice and says it. But you're right. Words have powers because we give them power.
Yeah, where I'm from, like people call it to the dog in a loving manner, but brothers and sisters use it lovingly towards each other. People use it willy-nilly everywhere. But I've noticed when I'm on online with some American friends, there's a real stigma in America about it. In its reference,
it's such a dirty word here. Yeah.
And that kind of brings up the whole aspect of the fact that nothing is universal either. So yeah, we've talked about the difference between some people identify with a word that means something different to someone else, but also both of those things can mean different things in different places too.
Right. Yeah. And the idea that we can make words so touchy that you can't even say it on a podcast without worrying, like, what is the fallout? What is going to happen if we say it on this podcast? And there's a few I can think of. The one that I am so tiptoeing around, because I have no problem with the C word whatsoever. It's one of my favorite words. I love it. And I like being able to own words.
You'll
like
do well in Yorkshire.
Yeah, because I just don't believe in giving words power. But then other people, like, you can't deny when other people give them power, right? So like the N word. Like that is one I just like. That label is not a label that I would give anyone. And that's not because I have any fear of the word. It's because I have a respect for an entire group of people who are very sensitive to that word.
But then again, that links as well to what you're saying about people taking a word that's been used to describe them in a negative way and flipping it around and using it and themselves. And owning it. Yeah. That's a really good example of that.
Well, and I like how it's used within Black communities, that they can say it with each other and stuff. But there's still this sensitivity where people outside the Black community, it's still seen as so dirty when we use it. And so I don't necessarily think that that's right or fair, but I can acknowledge that that's the case, and I could choose not to use it just because, like, to me, the only way in which it will be interpreted is disrespectful, and that's not my intention, right?
Yeah, and
so it's almost like.
Go on, sorry, I thought you finished. Go.
Well, I was gonna say it's almost like you gotta. Sometimes you got to acknowledge the truth of the matter, right?
Yeah.
And in Britain, it's funny because I don't remember the exact laws, but there's actually different laws regarding racial slurs depending on who is using them. If it's frowned upon to be used anywhere, there are laws against its use anywhere. But if it's been used within communities, it's treated differently. If it's used by someone from outside that community,
it would be classed as like hate speech or something, wouldn't it? It's those sorts of laws.
I can't remember. I've actually read up on the law on it, and I can't remember. It was a few years ago, and I can't remember the exact where it stated. It was like subsection 1, subsection B, one of those things, and they are actually viewed differently in law, although they are both frowned upon. So
that. Oh, go ahead.
No, go on. Carry on.
No, I was just gonna say that kind of illustrates how it shows the power that social conditioning gives to these various different labels, and how within one context it's perfectly okay to say it, within another context it's like absolutely horrendous to say it.
I think we may have lost Laura again.
I think so. She'll catch up.
Yeah. While we are waiting for Laura, let's have a think about, because we're going to take a commercial break shortly. And when we get back from the commercial break, let's have a think, because we've talked quite a lot about kind of specific labels and things like that and how they're used. But what labels do you think, this might be quite a difficult question actually, what labels do you think you might attribute to yourself in the future? I know that's quite difficult because we don't know how things are going to change in the future, but let's have a think about what labels we might attribute to ourselves, looking at how we might move forward in our lives and how we might change politically, how we might learn new things and choose to attribute labels differently in that manner. We'll speak about that when we come back from a commercial break. We've not got much coming up, I don't think, over the next week. I'm on Ask an Atheist tomorrow night.
Nice. Good deal.
So I was supposed to be on that a few months ago, but we had a bit of a problem with scheduling, so it's been rearranged for tomorrow night. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure who's going to be doing it, whether it's going to be Ethan, because Notes Mortem has been hosting it in recent weeks, and I'm very excited to be on. And while we're talking about Ethan, I'll just give him a shout out. I know we do this quite regularly, but he really does facilitate new YouTubers. He works a lot with Oz Tart's channel, and it's such a hard worker. He's by far the hardest working content creator in our community. It really goes out and pushes out, and he puts.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, nice. We've got you back.
Welcome back.
Have you got anything coming up, Laura?
I don't, honestly. Going back to work full time, I've actually taken stuff off my schedule so that I'm not so worried about scheduling conflicts and stuff like that. So yeah, my schedule's clear for now.
Yeah, and that's what we were talking about the other week, isn't it? When we were talking about coming to the end of lockdown and everybody's lives changing completely. And like, you know, everybody, we seem to like, all us three especially got into this kind of content creation just as the first like
lockdowns and
global lockdown hit, and like everything.
And now real life is coming back around, and it's going to be conflicting a little bit.
Yeah, so anyway, we're, you know, go and check out Ethan's stuff. He's a brilliant creator. He does so much stuff and facilitates so many people. Please go and check out his channel.
While you're doing that, you can also bob along to linktr.ee/skeptic hangout, where you can find a link to us on YouTube and Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and all of the podcatchers out there, as well as
just everywhere.
We are profusely outputting our material onto every platform available. And while you're there as well, you can also join our Facebook discussion group, where you can have some conversations, debates, and discussions around topics that we talk about on the show, as well as sort of just general other stuff as well. So yeah, go join that. And
fantastic.
All of that stuff.
Right, so we will catch you shortly, where we're going to be talking about what labels we might apply to ourselves in the future. Okay, so before the commercial break, we asked, what labels do we think we might apply to ourselves in the future?
Was that the royal we then, Gilliver? We asked.
Yeah. We asked. Yes.
So that is a really super interesting question, right? Because it assumes a couple of different things. Like, one, it assumes where we're wanting to go and that we know where we're wanting to go. And then it also assumes that we're not there yet, right? So a label that we want to apply in the future, the question then would be, why aren't we applying it now, right? So then it assumes that it's one we haven't achieved yet, or it's one that we haven't gotten to yet.
Yeah, because like the labels that we talked about before, some of them are descriptive of us innately as people. So like, you know, I can be described as a Yorkshireman because I was born in Yorkshire and I'm a man.
Mm-hmm.
But then other things are descriptors of my skills and likes and abilities and desires and whatever else. So yeah, some descriptions that might be applicable to me in the future, things like grandfather,
Grandma.
which,
Yep, that was one.
yeah, those sorts of things. So, but that's certainly not a given. But then also it's like, in terms of usefulness as an identifier for yourself, that will be up there on my bio as one of the, as one of the labels on there if I was a grandfather, because that would be a source of pride for me. I imagine my grandchildren would be nice enough for me to value that in myself. Whereas there are other labels in the future. There are other labels, things like I consider myself a socialist, but then I assume I will continue associating with that label, for example, in the future. But I mean, I know statistically people become more conservative on average as they get older. And so then that makes me think, well, is that the case that my values will change, or is it my, there's quite a lot to that sort of thought process, I guess.
Yeah. So go ahead. Go ahead, Richard.
I was just going to.
Well, I was going to say exactly
Laura,
because of that. Like,
you get talking.
And hopefully it won't freeze now because this phone has full service and we should be good to go. But anyway, should have just started with this phone. But so going along with what you were saying, like, yeah, there's some labels that I can think of, like grandma, that like are not guaranteed, but are pretty likely to come up in the future just based on like the trajectory of my life. But then there's also like, I am so hesitant to adopt labels or even try to adopt labels that are political or religious or ideological. So I don't particularly see any labels in the future in that respect that I want to take on or that I think I'll take on. Although knowing me, I probably eventually will, just because I do like to group associate or like community associate. So once I find that group, I am likely to associate with them. But the one that I see the most for me is like author. Like I really want to be a published author, right? So when I think of labels in the future, I think of goals. Like I want to be retired, right? Like that label. I want to be a published author. I want to be like a better rock climber. So right now I wouldn't even call myself a climber, but that's something that I want to achieve eventually. So those are the kinds of labels that I can think of for the future, are all around like achievements that I haven't achieved yet. Does that make any sense?
Mm-hmm. Very much so, yeah. So when I thought of this question, it had nothing to do with kind of the answers that either of you have given. I was thinking more,
interesting. That's so
which
cool.
is really. I was thinking more, and although I didn't have a definitive label in mind, I was thinking more about the fact that, and one issue that came up that I'm not ignorant on, but it's an issue that I could learn so much more about, and I love listening to people who are authorities on it, and it's the trans issue. It's something I don't know much about. I'm really excited to learn more about. And it's something that, although I don't have in mind whether I'd use the term ally or something along those lines, it's something that I can see in the future, labels coming out that might apply to me in regards to that.
I like that.
As I learn more about it and become more educated on it. And of course, the hopefully grandfather one, although I being incredibly old now, and whether alive is one I'd like to use in the future.
Alive, I like to continue to use that label.
Yeah.
But I like that you brought up the LGBT stuff, because those labels are constantly changing and evolving and being invented as people think of new ways of expressing themselves. And so you're kind of right. Like I have a lot of labels around my sexuality. Like I consider myself very gender fluid. I don't have a lot of dysmorphia, but I do have like curiosity in terms of like, hey, I'm okay being a woman, curious about what it would be like to be a man. And I sort of have that little drive, but I don't have the same dysmorphia that a trans person would have. So I call myself more gender fluid, but there may be a better term for me out there. I call myself pansexual, where I used to call myself bisexual, because I didn't know there was a distinction between the two. I didn't even know there was more than, gay, straight, or bisexual.
But the whole thing about bi and pan is interesting as well, isn't it? Because like some people use the term bi to mean pan. Just to clarify for people who don't know the difference, so like bisexual implies that you're interested sexually in both men and women, whereas pansexual people use to mean that it's sort of trans inclusive and that it's sort of everyone as opposed to just identifying as men and women. Whereas I
Right.
think lots of people who use the term bi may mean it in the pan sense, but then
Correct.
but it's again hard to know, isn't it, because of definitions and perspectives.
It's very interesting actually, because there's a couple, I'll not name them, but there's a couple that we're all familiar with. One associates themselves with the label they them, and their partner has spoken publicly about how he found it difficult to apply the label bisexual to himself because of the status of his partner, and it took him a long time to come to terms with that. And it's that education, people speaking publicly about it, that we need more of, an open subject. And there are some great content creators talking about this at the moment. You've got Arden of Eden, and have you worked with Arden on the non-profits? Laura?
I've worked with Arden a few different times. Yeah.
And Katie Montgomery, people like that. And there were a lot of people talking about this stuff.
And educating on what the different things are. And those labels can be very, very confusing, and there's not a lot of literature or education out there about them. I think it's getting better, but I didn't know about a lot of these labels until I took an anthropology of gender class, and I was like, oh, here's like 6 or 7 labels that apply to me that I've never applied to myself before because I didn't even know they existed, or I hadn't reflected on it enough to give what I was thinking or feeling a label.
Which kind of makes me think of that whole thing of like actual labels as a tool for self-identification purposes. Like you were saying, like maybe labels come across a label that you've not heard before that then suddenly opens your eyes to an aspect of yourself that maybe you weren't aware of before, for example. I think that's possibly the sort of thing you were talking about.
Yeah, and I think like Jill, over the fact that that's what you were thinking of and that Gil and I went in completely different directions. I think it's really cool that you thought of it in that way, because that spurs a whole nother lane of discussion about the evolution of labels, right? And how they're kind of ever changing. They're always being created. And then once they're created, they're very fluid. Like maybe bi in the past was too limiting of a label. So it applied to everybody, including people who now would identify as pan, right? So that label encompassed so many people that these sub-labels kind of broke out to break them down even further and increase understanding. So when I say, hey, I'm pansexual, that instantly gives people information that they don't have if I say I'm bisexual. And it gives them a lot more information than if I don't just tell them at all and people just assume I'm straight because I'm married to a man, right? So yeah, it's interesting. I don't know. It's interesting the way that labels are evolving so quickly in regards to sexuality and gender and even what would you call it? Cultural labels, you know?
Yeah. And the reason I thought of that question is because I don't have a difficulty with the concept. I understand the concept, and I'm fully supportive of the community. Absolutely, 100% behind the community. But I'm aware that there's so much I don't know. I'm aware of my own ignorance on the topic, and that's what spurred me to ask the question. But regarding not knowing, and certainly in where I live, it's still a very taboo subject. And it's not spoken about at all. And even if it is, it's usually in a derogatory manner.
I don't know if I would use the word taboo to describe it as much as there is just such a vast amount of ignorance that it just doesn't come up in conversation. It doesn't get talked about.
There is, but the point I was about to make was it's not just kind of your kind of old coal miner in Yorkshire, like racist, like intrinsically racist and homophobic people who are ignorant of it. I've got a lot, I've had a lot of things to do with ladies' football teams, which contain a high proportion of gay women, and there's some real like resentment towards trans community in within,
for sure, still,
like lesbians. I've noticed a lot of like gay women are really like against this idea of the trans community. And it's something I find really puzzling because it's a community that have themselves had prejudice, so much prejudice in the past. And I just wondered on what your thoughts on that were, on that more, that you know, there are a lot of kind of white, you know, coal mining racist, like old miners who are like against it. But what about the people who should be accepting it and should be getting behind it and support these people? What are your thoughts on that community?
So within the LGBT community, I think the one thing that teaches us, maybe specifically in regards to labels, but also in regards to communities, is that we're all pretty equal at the end of the day in terms of our shortcomings, right? Like there aren't very many communities. They are out there, but there aren't very many communities that are wholly accepting or are entirely non-biased or non-bigoted or whatever. Like, and we're talking communities broad. Yeah. Like in general, we don't tend to like what we don't understand, right? So you can be a very, very accepting person in all other regards, but say the gay female community in general, like there's a percentage of those women that just don't understand trans, just like there's a percentage of straight women and straight men that don't understand trans, right? So just because you're in a community that might be more inclusive in some ways, it's important for us to remember that we all still have, we're still ignorant. Like there's still so much we don't know. And when there's something like that that's really contentious, you're not going to get acceptance automatically just because just because you're in a community that might also be minimized.
Which leads me on to thinking about those community labels, which I think is really interesting. And you know, when people are labeled as part of the Black community or the gay community or the what, you know, all the sorts of
Asian American
community, and actually we talk about these communities as if they are sort of, I don't know, labels can be so descriptive and expansive, but then sometimes labels can be really like boxing in people to have, you know, where it gives us a very specific and limited idea about what those people are or stand for or what have you. So we talk about the LGBT community. And I think, like you were saying, Gilliver, if we're talking about the LGBT community and those people who are anti-trans that you were talking about before, we expect that because they're part of the LGBT community that they therefore should be pro-trans and pro all this, whereas it doesn't mean that at all necessarily, just because they're under that umbrella box of being in that community. And often we talk about labeling people as being part of these broad sweeping communities because it's, like, I guess, necessary for conciseness in conversation and talking about things. But often I think that can be just more limiting and actually, I don't know, potentially causes more problems than it solves.
And there's also a lot of confusion. This is where labels actually become more confusing and less helpful, is there's a lot of confusion when you lump in everything into the LGBT community, for example, or Asian American or Black American. And we fail to see that within those communities, there's so much diversity, right? So sex and gender and sexual attraction are all three very, very different things. So who you're sexually attracted to may have nothing to do with your sex or your gender, right? And your gender may have nothing to do with who you're sexually attracted to. Like they're all such separate issues. And yet we lump them all together into LGBT. And it's good in the sense that it gives all of them more power. It's like power in numbers, right? And it kind of gets more attention to each one of them individually by giving them all attention at once. But at the same time, we have to remember that just because a person has a sexuality, for example, where they are attracted to someone of the same sex or they're attracted to someone of the opposite sex, that says nothing about their understanding of gender, right? And how gender affects them or how they identify with their gender.
I think
they're just two completely separate issues.
Statistically speaking, people who we would lump in that LGBT community possibly and probably are more likely to be, you know, sort of more clued in as to all these sorts of issues and may have done more research and be, you know, read up on it and stuff. But that's certainly not the case. And you kind of would assume that from,
well, it is, but it's a generalization.
Label.
Yeah.
You know,
there's a lot of science coming out in support of the kind of the things that Laura was talking about, identity and the difference between sex and identity and gender. There's a lot of new science coming out, which a lot of people aren't aware of. It's just not getting the kind of public push it needs. It's not like there's an asteroid heading for Earth kind of headline, is it? You know what I mean?
Right.
And it should be. it should be, and because these communities deserve and should be recognized for being who they are, and they're just not. And it's so, I was just slightly going off that community, but I was watching a video today actually with Jenna Mayo, and she was talking about I love the work she does. It's fantastic. She's also been on the non-profits and that, I believe, for Laura. It's like Richard brings up Laura's reunion show. But she's brilliant, Jenna. I absolutely adore her. And she was talking about how like being atheist in the Black community, it's something that is such a taboo in America.
Oh,
because
for sure. Yeah.
It's like, it's the Black community is so intrinsically like together with the Christian community that to say you're atheist is almost like announcing that you're leaving the Black community. And
right.
It's so amazing when you're not part of those communities. It takes so much education to understand, even if you're on their side. It takes so much education to understand, and you'll never fully understand it. You'll never be able to stand exactly in their shoes, but you can support and facilitate them. And there's just not enough of that going on. And I think education really needs to be pushed forward so that people understand far more. So after that long kind of rambling rant, I've actually got a question to do with that. Is how do you think?
I do too.
How do you think we should go to about both us as content creators and people who are in mainstream media and in government? How do you think the best way to proceed in normalizing those communities goes?
Well, and before we answer that question, because I like that question, I just wanted to throw out the one that I have kind of around what you were saying, like within the communities is, and just think about what we're answering your question is, how much of it do you think is educating within the public school and within social media, and how much of it is family and community educating, right? And I'll expand on that more later, but I wanted to throw that out there now before we answered your question, just because I know I'm going to lose it. So just something for you guys to think about.
It's hard, isn't it? Because I think a lot of those ideas, there's then that discussion of, is it something that should find its place in public school systems? Is it the sort of thing that should find its place in people's living rooms that they talk about as a family? And not in terms of sort of discussing appropriateness or anything like that, because I think all of it is appropriate for everyone. But like, yeah, like I think for a government to say we need to talk about this and prioritize this, and obviously we're talking in general terms here, but I think it's just a lot of it's opinion and priority, isn't it, in terms of this is the thing they want to normalize. And when we're talking about labels specifically, and when we're talking about terminology that, like we've said, changes all the time and adapts and all those sorts of things, I think it's really difficult to address sort of whole hog in a way.
Yeah. So to go back to Gilliver's question about like, what do we do as content creators? And I think that I can actually wrap kind of both up all in one. As content creators, I think the best we can do is talk about it and be open about it. And if we do have any sort of biases, maybe try to identify them, maybe try to ask about them or learn more about them, or at least be honest about them. And then the other thing is to get people to work with us that are parts of these different communities and to get them to talk on their own behalf instead of us talking for them. Yeah. So like I can talk night and day about like how much I support the trans community, but am I really educating other people just by lending my support? Or would it be even more impactful if I had trans people on to talk about that kind of stuff, where you're hearing it directly from the person who's experiencing it and not just from this other person who heard through the grapevine that that's what this is like. Right. So I think it's kind of twofold as content creators, between lending our own voices of support, but also using our platforms to give those people in those communities their own voices. And then what we talked about, my question and how they kind of tie together. I really think that the reason why some of these things change so slowly is because family and community tends to have a stronger connection in people's heads than just education and social media. So what you learn from your family, what you learn from your community, you tend to learn deeper and it becomes more ingrained in you. So when you do hear something on social media that disagrees with it, you have to hear it relentlessly and a lot and in certain ways in order to start to disagree with the status quo that's been established for you, right? It takes a lot more effort. So we can just smash pro whatever community or group all over the internet and all over the news and stuff, but it's going to take a hell of a lot of it to break through the social barriers that are established by family, friends, community, churches, whatever.
Yeah,
So
and
I
think
think
that's where sorry, continue. Sorry.
No, I was almost done. I was going to say, I think that that we're fighting an uphill battle, and it's just going to take longer because of it. You're breaking down people one at a time.
Yeah, and I think that's where education comes into it. It's like, I don't know if you remember the first long big rant I had when, I don't know if it was episode 1 or 2, way back when we'd first began, and I had a big long rant about education. And I think this is one of those issues which falls into that same category. This is something that needs to be taught in schools. It's something that we're not going to change everybody's mind overnight. There's going to be a lot of resistance to it. It's one of those issues where it's the next generation who are going to push forward and be the ones who normalize it. Get it taught in schools. Get these issues brought up out in the open in the school environment, so the children are talking about it, so the children understand it. And as the children grow older, and all the old fuddy-duddies who have resistance to it.
One person getting old and dying at a time, right?
Yeah. It's the way forward.
It's the education and I think that's definitely get it normalized in schools. I certainly, as I've already said, I need a lot of education on trans issues myself. I definitely do. I'm 100% supportive of the community. I don't fully understand all the issues and the nuances that go on about it.
But you're willing to understand.
Certainly educate my children. So support those people. I think it's vitally important. I mean, my kids have got gay aunties. So they're already, I mean, they're 5 and they're 8, my children. And they same-sex relationships are already normalized to them. They don't think anything at all of people in the same sex being in a relationship. They understand it.
Right.
And I think
I love that you use the term normalize. You used it several times while you were talking.
Yeah.
Because it's not just about like, oh, here's this exotic thing that you need to learn about. Here's this thing that it's not like we should teach LGBT issues as though we're teaching about like, say, China or Indonesia or somewhere where it's like far away and it's exotic and it's different. We need to normalize it, like you said, where if you're just surrounded by it, if it's just part of your social media experience, it's part of your family experience, part of your friend experience, it's just in movies or on TV or in video games, but it's not highlighted, it's not put in your face, it's just part of the worlds that we create, the imaginary worlds that we create, then it becomes less mysterious. Like what you're talking about with your kids, they're just used to it because they're around it, right? So instead of making it like this big issue, one thing we could do is just make it normal, like make it part of our everyday lives.
Yeah, and it's just occurred to me that we've got the episode about labels, and what we're saying is smash those labels and just make it normal, so we don't need to use labels to describe people who have a different lifestyle to the ones that are currently normalized to us. Let's normalize them so they're not different.
It's not necessarily about smashing them. It's about taking away people's power to use them negatively, like make them just so everyday that it's normal. Like you don't smash the label woman just because you use it normally. But trans woman might be one that still needs to be used a little bit more often before it becomes as normal as woman.
I hear lots online about, like people who identify as gay, like the fact that people have to come out as gay because the normal label for people is heterosexual, and the fact that they identify with a different label means that they have to announce to people in order for people to know that about them. And I think it's really interesting, sort of going back to something you were talking about before. I realized, and I know we've sort of gone down an LGBT thing, but I think all the labels things are really relevant to this.
Right.
I realized a few years ago that my eldest son, who's now 10, must have been like 4 or 5. And he said something, it came up in conversation about boys who kiss boys, and he thought that was gross and his mind couldn't get around it and he didn't understand it. And it was like one of those like light bulb moments where I was like, every book we have in our house is straight and heteronormative. Everything he sees on TV is straight and heteronormative. every story that I tell him that I know from my childhood, like fairy tales and whatever, are all straight and heteronormative. And like all of that is kind of not my fault, but like, because everything by default is that, it's then, what's the point I'm trying to make? Like, because things are labeled as like gay films or homosexual literature, or it's got these extra labels which make it somehow different. I think there is a thing where people often feel like, well, I don't want to watch that film because it's a gay film, as opposed to just like being a romance film or just being a film, you know. And I'm not saying I have that pushback, because I absolutely don't, but it was just me realizing that actually I need to actively embrace those things in order to normalize that aspect of people and those sorts of labels within my children, because otherwise they are going to see people who are labeled as all those things as different and separate, as opposed to just, you know, people.
Just one more way of doing life. Yeah. You talk about the whole like coming out thing. That is one thing that I've told my kids is like, whatever your label is, you decide like how you show people and how you express it to people and who and when and all that stuff. But one thing, like I saw a meme on Facebook the other day that I thought was really cool. I mean, I might be getting off subject just a little bit, but the meme basically said, I don't want you to come to me and come out and say, Mom, I'm gay, right? Like, just bring your boyfriend home the same as you bring home a girlfriend and say, hi, this is so-and-so, my boyfriend. And I'll be like, cool, let's have some sodas, right? Like it should be no different bringing home a partner of the same sex as bringing home a partner of the opposite sex, or bringing home multiple partners, or whatever the case may be. Like, you don't have to out yourself with it. Just do it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. But I think that's intrinsically linked to those labels, isn't it? You know, like, and then on the opposite side of that, those labels are still kind of important, because like people still nowadays are fighting for rights for gay people and trans people and lesbians and pan and all of those other labels and stuff. So in the one sense, we're kind of arguing that the labels shouldn't and don't matter, and to minimize the sort of impact they should have. But then on the other hand, they actually still really, really do matter for the people involved in, you know, the rights and liberties and freedoms of those people as well.
And
the only difference.
Sorry, Laura, go on.
I was going to say the only difference I would say with what you were just saying is I don't think that the labels are unimportant. I think they're very important. I think there's a difference between making a label unimportant or irrelevant and making a label normal. So when we say normalizing, I don't think that in any way means. I think that's what I meant. Okay, yeah, because you were saying like make it unimportant or whatever. I think
when I said unimportant, I mean as in like unimportant in terms of like obviously the way we treat people, or things, you know, like unimportant in terms of personal relationships between people. Like if someone is gay in your life, that is almost unimportant in terms of like it shouldn't
how you relate to them
and how you that's
and how you treat them.
Going back to, I know we're coming to the end of the show now, but relating to what Richard said earlier, way back in the show, said about labels being different as we go around the world, and normalizing same-sex relationships and trans people is something that is really different. That's something that has real extremes in different parts of the world and in different cultures. And
absolutely,
I think if we are to make a change, we need to normalize it in our own culture, to lead by example, because we're not going to be able to walk into those places and say this is normal, because
it's not yet. It's not yet. Yeah, we have a long way to go. I remember my 11-year-old son asked me a few months ago. He's like, "Mom, why do some people hate gay people?" And he was baffled. He couldn't understand it, and I had to sit there and have a conversation about like our history and how we've treated people in the past and our own cultural biases and taboos and stuff. And he was, because I've never exposed him to any sort of hate for any sort of group of people, he couldn't fathom why other people would feel that way.
Yeah. I know my best friend's a lesbian, and she I know when she goes on holiday to other places, they have to check what the laws are before they go. To see if it's okay for them to hold hands in public or kiss in public, any of those things, because you just don't know. You don't know when you go into these other places what their laws or rules are on it.
Yeah, we still have a long way to go.
Yeah, most definitely. Richard, Gil.
Hello. Yeah, and I think, sorry, I just sort of zoned out. I think that's where as well that point of labels have power becomes apparent, because labels in terms of identity for ourselves are important, but also as a point to rally around, to push forward, positive change in society is also an incredibly important part of it. Whether that's for racial equality or freedom for people of different sexual orientations or identities. And without the labels there in place, I don't think any progress in those sorts of areas would be as easy, because there's not that, like I say, point to rally around. But yeah, this has been a really interesting conversation.
Yeah. And as we were saying earlier, it's one that came up it's the first one we've done, which has kind of been just thought up on the floor mid-conversation in an episode. And we've decided to go with it and see where we'd go with it.
I mean, we really could have done the whole last episode just on labels, because it was just something that was so relevant to the topic that we were discussing. And
we're not mentioning humanism once today.
Yeah, because it would seem so obvious if all three of us just labeled ourselves as humanists. And the fact that we do struggle with whether or not to label ourselves as this or that, within, like, say, the atheist community or the skeptic community, that we do still have certain labels that we wrestle with. I think that this was more of an extension of last week's episode, even more so than like its own specific episode, or at least I hope it tied in well, because I think that the two discussions together tie really well together.
Yeah, definitely.
Agreed.
So, final thoughts then on labels, McGee.
Labels, I would say good, bad, and neutral. There's a lot of use for labels. We are by nature categorizing animals. And so it's something that we do just naturally without even thinking about it. And it has relevance. I would say, in terms of my feelings on labels, I'd say be careful with them, because they can be used to misunderstand people. They can be used to segregate people or to separate them and make them the others. Or they can be used to help understand people and be more compassionate towards them and understand them without needs for long explanations. So I think that, like every single other social construct, it's what you do with them that makes them good or bad.
I think my sort of final thoughts are that I think it can be useful to sort of tell people labels that you apply to yourself. And obviously when you're in conversation with people, you kind of sometimes have to apply labels to other people. But if people are using a label, I think it's ever more important to really understand what they mean by that label, and not to assume things on top based on your own sort of biases and prejudices and your own past. So yeah, really understanding what people are meaning when they use a certain word or phrase, I think is really important.
Yeah, I agree with you both, and I think
agree.
Just following on from what Richard says, I think if you don't understand, be willing to be educated and ask questions, and just be willing to sit down and listen. That's the best way to learn. Sit down, listen, talk to people who use labels that you might not be familiar with, and get their perspective, because they're living it.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that reminds me. I just want to add, Jill, really quickly, like, use a label yourself to help people to understand you. Like, say, oh, I'm this or I'm that, as a way of communicating to understand you better. But when someone else is using a label, don't make any assumptions.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I like that. Like, ask questions, ask what they mean about it, ask them to expand on it.
Because I'm pretty sure that most people who use a label to describe themselves would be very happy to explain what they mean by that. It's
absolutely.
I think it's taking away those assumptions and being open to other people's ideas and interpretations, I think, is just one of the most valuable things you can do.
Yeah.
I like it.
McGee, thank you for joining us on your break. We do appreciate it.
From the mountains.
I am so glad I was able to do this. I know we had some trouble last week getting our second episode done, and this week is our 4th of July weekend. So I'm glad I was able to still join you guys and still enjoy my 4th of July. I got the best of both worlds, and I really appreciate that. I hope that the blips in the beginning weren't too bad.
Yeah, we apologize to the viewers and the listeners for the technical difficulties.
We don't, but Laura should.
I do.
I deeply apologize for being unapologetically me. I am very apologetic about the tech issues earlier.
We'll be
no,
back.
hopefully it'll just add character to this episode.
Yeah, we'll be back next week, hopefully with the special guest we were supposed to have this week, which was due to scheduling
anticipation.
Yeah, you don't know what it is yet. They're still fantastic.
Yep.
So unfortunately, due to a few scheduling hiccups, we had to postpone them. But you've got this wonderful episode instead now. So lucky yous.
All right. So we will see you all next week. And until then, we are Laura,
Richard,
and this has been Skeptic Hangout. Until next time,
keep questioning,
interrogate your beliefs,
and stay skeptical.
Bye.
Bye.